True. Good whatever time of the day it is, strangers. Ever heard of precognitive dreams? Dreams that seemingly predict the future? It's a surreal concept, one you've certainly heard mentioned in countless other scary stories. But apparently, studies have shown that roughly a quarter of the population experiences at least some form of precognitive dreaming. I've personally never experienced any, but I know of someone who has, and with uncanny detail as well. To this day, they still report having them, and in every instance, what they forewarned has always come into fruition. Whether you believe in them or not, it wouldn't hurt to lend your ear to today's horror from the miscellaneous. The first one I've ever written, in fact. Noel was an ambitious college student who'd bitten off more than he could chew when he adhered to stay after hours on his college campus and aid his professors in whatever endeavor they needed accomplished, on top of working as a cashier at a local convenience store. Noel's professors valued him for being intelligent, ethical, and opportunistic, and Noel was a guilty people pleaser. To him, it would have been criminal not to lend a helping hand. One particular evening, after a long and stressful day of cleaning, writing, and running back and forth from point A to B, Noel anticipatedly retired to his bedroom, wanting nothing more than to sleep the world away. A few hours later, Noel's friend, Leighton, shrugged him awake, clearly excited about something. "Hey, Sleepyhead, wake up!" Noel replied, irritated and groggy from his involuntary awakening. "What, dude? What?" "Hey, I know you've been busy these past few weeks, what with work and volunteering." "I never volunteered," Noel butted in. "If you never volunteered, then why are you literally helping our instructors come up with new ways to torture us? Traitor. Anyways, I wanted to ask, no, demand that you come with me to Calvin's birthday party tonight. To take a load off. You've been working pretty hard these past few weeks, and I think you deserve a break." "Party? Leighton, what time is it?" Leighton pulled out his phone to check the time. 8:17? "No, his party. What time is it happening?" "I thought you already knew." "It's tonight at 12. Midnight? Elle, why are you telling me this now? Do you not check Instagram?" Calvin literally said, word for word, on a post he made 5 days ago, "Who's coming to my B-Day party this Friday night? 12 a.m. Parents will be gone all weekend." "Did you not just mention how overworked I am? I don't have time for social media." "You sound just like my dad. See, this is exactly why you need to go. You're 19, you're in college, you're destroying yourself physically and mentally, picking up trash, adding more work to your plate, helping our degenerate professors give us more homework, and working as a cashier at a literal gas station." "Now you sound like my dad," Noel sighed. Leighton chuckled briefly despite his attempt not to. "This is not a laughing matter." He turned to face his right in an attempt to avoid eye contact. He looked uncharacteristically serious and disappointed. Noel noticed this and, after a brief moment of ruminating, reluctantly agreed to go to Calvin's party. Leighton's face immediately lit up. "Really?" Noel pulled his blanket over his head, wanting to end the conversation as soon as possible. Yeah, right after I get some rest. Promise. Now, leave me alone." Leighton happily returned to his apartment downstairs after taking Noel's phone off a nearby coffee table, setting an alarm on it, and gingerly setting it back down. You wake up in 2 hours, he said before departing. Noel wasn't looking forward to the party at all. He had a natural aversion to excessive social gatherings and would rather just sit at home working all day. But he digressed, as he didn't want to disappoint Leighton, and he secretly wanted to believe that a party would actually do him some good. Noel promptly returned to sleep, not bothering to get up from his couch and move to his more comfortable bed, which resided just left to where his couch was facing, an old black TV box left by his dad. And to the TV's right, the kitchen entryway. Behind his couch was his front door, derelict and in need of refurbishing. Time passed, and Noel suddenly awoke, not to the sound of an alarm, but to the sight of a barren and empty void encompassing him. Despite being aware of his own presence, Noel couldn't see or feel himself, as if he were a ghost. The void around him slowly began to shift, eventually taking the form of his living room where he was presently sleeping. Only it didn't look or feel the same. The room was uncannily dark and ominous. Nothing about it felt the slightest bit familiar. Noel had seemingly entered a state of sleep paralysis, unable to move, speak, or turn his head to look at his kitchen entryway, where the silhouette of a young boy began to manifest. Noel could vaguely make out the boy's appearance through his peripheral vision. He had pale skin and black, medium-length hair that flowed naturally to the side of his face, perfectly covering his right eye. The boy didn't move, only glared at Noel from the inside of his kitchen, which looked completely and utterly devastated, like a monster had ravaged it in a fit of unbridled rage. Finally, after what seemed like hours of waiting, the boy spoke in a cold, condescending tone of voice that left chills down Noel's spine. It would be the last thing he'd hear before he'd inevitably wake up moments after. I want to stay here. Here. I'm sorry, but you have to leave. Noel jolted awake. His face shone with ice-cold sweat under his living room light. Noel swiveled his head in every direction, his heart still racing from the dream or nightmare that had just transpired. But nothing was out of the ordinary. Everything was the same as it was hours earlier. As surreal as the experience was, Noel ultimately chalked it up to stress from the weeks prior, which further convinced him that he needed a well-deserved break. His eyes landed on his phone, which Leighton had set an alarm on however long ago. He picked it up and checked the time. It read 1:17 a.m. Noel was baffled. He was a relatively light sleeper. His alarms were perpetually set to play on the highest possible volume, and on top of that, Leighton had apparently texted him several times asking about his whereabouts. Noel had never slept through one of his alarms before, so he couldn't understand why this time would be any different. Nevertheless, he dismissed it and rushed to the party on foot, as his car was out of gas at the time, which, upon arriving, looked to only be getting started. The party lasted all throughout the night and into the early morning. Noel had fallen asleep halfway through. He never did get enough time to properly rest and recharge back at his apartment. He urged Leighton to not drink at all during the party, in case he had to be the one to drive them both home, a promise that he kept. The time was 8:42 a.m., and Leighton had just returned home with Noel soundly sleeping in the passenger seat of his car. Leighton shrugged him awake yet again, a look of arrogance beaming across his face as his friend's eyes began to open. Noel was reluctant to admit it, but he did in fact have an enjoyable time at the party, though Leighton would be the one to call him out before he got a chance to. And you said you didn't like parties, Leighton sneered. Fine, I'll admit it. It was the biggest break I had all month. Thank you. There, you happy? Noel's sarcasm was patently apparent. I'm sure it was. You slept through most of it, and you didn't even have to drink anything. That's because I don't drink. They both laughed at each other's expenses. It then dawned on Noel that the fun he had at that party up until when he fell asleep was immeasurable compared to what he's been putting himself through for the past couple months. At that moment, he promised to himself and Leighton that he would take a step back from work and prioritize himself more. Noel thanked Leighton for always looking out for him and trekked back up to his apartment, alone. Noel unlocked his front door and entered his cramped living space, planning to call his professors as soon as he got settled in and renounce his agreement to helping around the campus. But something didn't feel right. All the lights in the apartment were turned off, and Noel had sworn he'd left them on before he rushed off for the party. Even more peculiar was his oddly disorganized kitchen, which looked as if it had been partially looted. It was uncannily dark, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get the lights to work. The entire setting was disturbingly reminiscent of his nightmare. Noel felt a familiar chill run down his spine, and cold sweat bead down his face. He set his stuff down next to his couch and walked over to his bedroom door. Something definitely didn't feel right. Noel felt as if he had stepped into the wrong apartment that day. An ironic feeling. He opened the door and froze. He felt his heart pounding against his chest, and his body go numb. On his bed stood the same boy from his nightmare. Only now Noel could see him much clearer. He wore an oversized black leathery coat and pairs of broken glasses, tattered pants, and black, worn-out boots. Noel could only stare at him in horror as memories of his past began flashing before his eyes. The atmosphere felt thick and heavy, yet the boy's eerily cold voice managed to break through, laden with a level of exasperation Noel had never heard before. "I thought you left. Why are you still here?" He looked as if he had been betrayed by a close friend. "I gave you a warning. I told you that I wanted to stay here. Here!" He paused, as if realizing something. "What? You thought it was just a bad dream? That it wasn't real? That I wasn't real? Just a figment of your imagination? Well, you wouldn't be the first one, because it seems like no matter where I go, no one ever takes me seriously." Tears began streaming down his face. "And I thought you were different. You know? That for once in a painfully long time, I finally found someone who understood, who'd let me in with no protest and leave me to finally rest in peace." He sighed. "I guess I was wrong." At that remark, the door slammed into Noel's face with such force that it broke his nose. He let out a guttural scream that everyone in his building should have heard. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and began dialing 911 when he felt something coil around his ankle and up his left leg. He looked down to see a thick, green vine spiral up his leg at an alarming speed. Noel desperately tried to pull it off as its grip grew tighter and tighter, slowly cutting off blood flow through his leg. He thought fast and bit down hard on the vine, ripping it in two and enabling him to escape. He turned on his phone's flashlight and aimed it at the bottom of his bedroom door. Dozens of similarly thick green vines were seamlessly growing out from under and around his door. He darted the light around his apartment in horror as he saw more and more vines growing from vents in his ceiling and out of various cracks and crevices previously unnoticed in the walls. Noel resumed dialing 911, but a sudden thud beneath the floorboards startled his phone out of his hands. It fell to the floor in a loud thud, and before Noel could reclaim it, was immediately crushed and overtaken by multiple, much smaller green vines. Vines began sprouting from his ceiling light and from beneath his bathroom door. Unable to call from his phone, Noel opted to call from his landline, which sat atop a coffee table that stood directly next to his TV. He started towards the landline, and upon reaching it, began dialing. But as if in response, more vines began speedily growing up the coffee table and around the landline, crushing it with unnatural strength. Noel backed away in shock and turned to his front door, his last chance at salvation. He vaulted over his couch and ran towards his front door. Noel tried his best to open the door, but no matter how hard he pulled, it refused to budge, as if it was being held closed. He could feel himself making progress, however, and so he persisted, not seeing any other way to escape. Noel turned to find hundreds of vines slowly creeping towards him, his apartment now completely unrecognizable. He heard the boy's steely voice echo throughout the apartment, as if on an intercom. "Oh, now you want to leave, after I already gave you a chance, and it took the threat of losing your own life to convince you. You're just like all the others. You don't care about anyone else but yourself." Noel refocused his attention back on the door. With each pull, he steadily pried it open, yet his trembling hands made the operation all the more difficult. Still focusing on his current situation, Noel yelled indirectly at the boy, less scared and more fed up with all that was happening. "What do you want from me?" The boy didn't respond. After what felt like hours, Noel had finally managed to pull his door open, ripping miscellaneous vines as he did, and promptly escaped, or so he thought. Upon exiting, instead of finding himself outside of his apartment, Noel found himself in the same barren void as the one he found himself in at the beginning of his nightmare. Noel looked down in bewilderment. There was nothing to be seen or heard for miles. He wondered whether or not everything he was experiencing was real or not. He stood there, unable to act, his mind racing with doubtful thoughts. Eventually, the door behind him slammed shut, startling Noel out of his stupor. He turned to face his front door, fear slowly creeping back inside him. Click. Noel heard the titular lock of his front door, and then the muffled voice of the boy on the other side. This. In similar fashion to the beginning of his nightmare, the black fog encompassing Noel gradually lifted to reveal a lengthy balcony interconnecting all the other apartments on his floor, and at each end a staircase that led up and down to the third and first floor of the complex respectively. The sun shone through the receding darkness. Soon, everything, the parking lot, the identical apartment complex that stood adjacent to the one he resided in, the sky, the clouds, and the people were eventually revealed. Noel leaned forward, putting his hands on the railing in front of him, and began to finally catch his breath. His eyes fell on Leighton's car, and tears began to stream down his face. In that moment, the reality of all that had just transpired hit Noel, and he realized just how close he came to dying. Leighton soon after walked out of his own apartment on the first floor and began walking up the flight of stairs to greet Noel, though he quickly noticed his friend's distress upon arriving. Leighton rushed over to him and asked if he was okay, but Noel was still reeling from the recent event. Noel turned to face Leighton, and a wave of relief washed over him. He collapsed into his arms and finally started crying, letting a gleeful smile manifest in the midst of his pain. Leighton, at a loss for words, could only console him in response. To this day, Noel still thinks back to that event, and wonders how differently things could have gone had he known the legend ahead of time. 26 years prior, a boy named Thomas Harris had died in his sleep due to malnutrition and sleep deprivation brought on by chronic stress. And so, never having been able to properly rest in peace, he'd since been roaming the southeastern U.S. in search of a residence where he could finally get some rest and where no one would disturb him. And when he had his eyes dead set on a property, regardless of if someone lived in it or not, there was little to nothing that could be done to persuade him otherwise. He's kind enough to warn his victims ahead of time via dreams, but if they choose to ignore him and didn't leave in under 6 hours, then he would make them leave by force. He'd never get to stay long in their homes, however, as people would inevitably be alerted of his presence and he'd be forced to relocate. Noel never returned to his own apartment and instead roomed with Leighton from then on. Whenever he'd walk past his apartment door, that same ominous chill would wash over him, and cold sweat would begin to bead down his face. And the same could have been said for any passerby who lingered for too long in front of that same door. The ominous atmosphere surrounding that apartment eventually forced nearby residents to move out, leaving the boy with more vacant space to make his own. It was only after authorities were called to investigate the anomaly surrounding the complex that the boy ultimately left, never to be seen in that area again. Best pay close attention to your dreams. You never know what they could tell you about your past, present, or future. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, feel free to like, subscribe, comment, all of that YouTube stuff. And if you didn't, well, I'm not going to apologize. And with that, I'll see you.